definition the most abstract way to talk about debating. Instead of what will happen in most of the member training sessions that you'll get throughout your time at Monash, where people will talk about particular issues. So Chris is going to talk about international relations, other people will talk about other things at the time, where the immediacy of that training is obvious. That when you get a topic about an international relations issue, you will remember the smart things that Chris said, you'll go and use it in a debate and say, wow, that was really useful. Chris hadn't told me that, I wouldn't have known that. In first principles, I'm going to use a few examples from time to time to illustrate that, but this in many ways is really more important than talking about individual issues, because the point of first principles is to give you a way to make sense of all the information that people are going to give you. Otherwise, what happens is you read, you watch TV, people talk to you in these sessions, you sit through debates, listen to people talk, years and years go by, huge volumes of information build up, and it all becomes quite useless. You remember about 5% of it, you forget most of the rest of the good stuff, and you don't remember or learn how to best use those good ideas and arguments that you might come across from time to time. The point of first principles is to give you a filing system, a way to store them, to use them, to understand how they relate to each other, and to recognise when your opponents are doing things that you've thought about before, even if you didn't think about them in that way. So it's difficult, it's abstract. Please stay with me, please ask lots of questions. We're going to try to cover a lot of ground. So, what is first principles? As I said, first principles is a way to organise information. Now, I put this up purely gratuitously because I think Clay Shirky's cool, and his book is all about the internet and the information age, and his idea that a lot of people think there's too much information in the world today. How can people possibly stay on top of things? All we've got to do is follow a few too many people on Twitter to realise just how much information there is in the world and just how hard it is to keep up with it all. But Clay's argument is there's no such thing as too much information, there's just a failure of filters. If you can think about information correctly, if you can filter it the right way, if you can cut out the crap you don't need and focus on the stuff you do need, then there's not too much information, there's just the right amount. That's what first principles is. It's a way to balance all the information that you're going to get. Now, I know you've covered some of this stuff, so I want to move through it really quickly, but tonight's a chance for me to test you on a few things and see just how basic we have to be before we move on to the hard stuff. So, before you can make much sense of definitions, of first principles, you need to make sure you're getting the definitions right. There is absolutely nothing more fundamental to having a good debate and having a chance of actually doing a good debate and giving a good speech than getting the definitions right. So, there are two major types of tests for definitions, depending on which tournaments you go to. So, British parliamentary style debates, which most of you probably haven't seen, but you'll learn about in the second half of this year, which is the style that the World Championships are held in, uses one type of definitional rule, which is semi-divine, and then Australasians and Easters and most 3-on-3 styles of debate, which you'd be more familiar with, use a test called the most reasonable test. Now, I could spend a lot of time talking about those different tests, but in practice, the mad/Victorian, because we really colonised most of Victoria, /Australian, because we really colonised most of Australia's thinking, way of dealing with this issue is to use exactly the same rules to apply. So even though in world style you have a bit more latitude than you do in 3-on-3 style, it's best, particularly when you're new to debating, not to really worry about that very much and to treat them as being exactly the same. And that's to apply two tests for figuring out whether you've got the right definition. The first test is context, and the second test is spirit of emotion. So, most of you should have heard this already, so let's do it really quickly. Context is just what's happening in the world. When you see the topic, the context should hopefully be obvious. So if the topic is that we should ban nuclear power, the context should scream out at you. Okay? It should be obvious what's going on in the world that relates to that topic. It didn't just come from nowhere. Probably the topic selectors were thinking about certain events that have been happening in the world in the not too recent past, which make that topic interesting and real and something worth your attention. So the context should be obvious. The only way you can get more context is to know more stuff, which means paying attention to the media. The second thing is harder, which is spirit of emotion. Spirit of emotion means how do you take that idea, okay, a debate about nuclear power obviously has some connection to Japan and Fukushima and all of that. Fine, I get that, that's where they want me to be. What am I supposed to do with that? What is the debate actually about? What is the test? What is the clash? What's the question to be answered in this debate? Who wants to give me an example? What would the spirit of the motion be in a debate about nuclear power? How would you make that into a real debate? How would you find a clash which you can actually try to resolve in the debate? Someone take a punt. This is another way of saying, what would your model be? I guess. That's a crude way. Have a shot. Anyone?
Whether you can intervene in market, like in the power industry.
Yep. When you intervene to ban new nuclear power stations. Yep. What else?
Shut down existing ones.
Shut down existing ones. Yep. What else?
Where else you can get the power from?
Well, yeah, that's an argument for the debate, not the clash. But yeah. So you see these are options. It's easy to see if we become more abstract. Let's take a completely ridiculous topic, which once upon a time I actually did in school, back in the days when we rode horses to school. And that was that it's better to plant roses than cabbages. And yes, I felt exactly the same way about it as you just did that. So, what does it mean?
Funding for the arts.
Most of you probably think it means nothing, right? But what's the metaphor? That it's better to plant roses than cabbages. What does it mean?
Beauty over utility.
You go.
Beauty over utility.
Sorry? Beauty over utility. Yeah, right. So do we use some resource, some space, some money, something? Do we use it in a way that has intrinsic value, but perhaps not practical value? Or do we maximise the amount of practical value we can get from it, even if that avoids or destroys something with intrinsic value? Right, great. Now, who cares? Because that's not a debate, right? That's a clash, but that's not a debate. You don't know what side you're on, what are you arguing for, what are you against? Right, but you're close, you're much closer. Now, you need to make it something real. You go back to context. What's it about? Someone give me a debate. Now you know what that metaphor means. What are you going to make the debate about? Whose side are you on? What are you for? What are you against? You had one.
Funding for the arts.
Right, how does that fit with the debate?
Well, it's about that artistic things should be funded by the government, and that's a good use of taxpayer resources.
Right.
So beautiful things and cultural things rather than healthcare and education and so forth.
Sure. Okay, anyone else? Someone give me something completely different. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but just to show that it doesn't need to be anything like that. It's a broad metaphor, right? It should apply to all kinds of stuff.
Do something on environment versus development.
Excellent. Give me a real example though, because that doesn't help you. What are you for? What's someone against? Come on, he's given you half the answer.
Punish crimes against the environment at the ICC.
Yeah, except that's kind of stupid, but I like it.
I did it like 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, but I like your moxie. That's good. Sorry, someone said carbon tax. Yeah, it's a bit. It's taking a tangential metaphor and making it more technical.
Cost development H, environmentally unfriendly countries.
Yeah, sure. How about a simple one like dams? Dams is a constant issue, right? At the moment, there's exactly the same debate in Ethiopia about a huge dam that they're proposing to build there as there is in Brazil, where they're proposing to build another huge dam. The debate's always the same. Right? The government says, we need this dam, these mega dams, because they'll create shitloads of cheap power. That power will then create space for new industries and jobs and prosperity and blah, blah, blah. But the problem is that we're going to absolutely rape and pillage the environment around the dam and probably screw over the indigenous people who live in that area too. But that's the trade-off. Right? So you take the idea, the broad idea, and you make it into something real. Okay, so if the topic was, which we'll probably get at Easter's, that we should crack down on gambling, what's the context? Easter's is a national tournament. Most of the contexts, except for the international relations type rounds, are usually national contexts. What's happening?
Point machine.
Right, ID cards for gambling. So, the spirit of the motion would be?
Yeah, we should have ID cards.
Yeah, the government's proposal is the obvious one. Right? Now you can tweak it if you want, that's fine, but when you're trying to find the right debate, you can't do worse than actually a real debate. So, just really quickly, those last two things to make sure everybody knows them. Place setting and time setting. There is no time setting allowed. All debates take place in the present or the immediate time. So you're allowed to say, for example, the topic was that we should, bomb North Korea back to the Stone Age. You're allowed to say, we would tell the North Korean government we're going to bomb them back to the Stone Age in 1 week unless they surrender. If they don't surrender and call elections, we're going to bomb them. That's okay. That's not unfair time setting. But saying we're going to bomb North Korea in 100 years' time when we're confident that the people won't rise up against the regime, and when we have bombs that can open doors and avoid civilians and knife Kim Jong-il, then we can use that, but not before. And obviously debates don't occur in the past, so you can't bomb Kim Jong-il when he was first born, going on to become the leader who would be so heavily mocked by us all. So, fair place setting is just the idea that you are allowed to place set a debate. You are allowed to say, this broad debate, like the one we talked about, the nuclear issue, takes place in this country or these countries. So you don't have to say that every country everywhere should close all of its nuclear power stations. You might set it just to Japan, or you might set it just to European countries who are talking about building new reactors. We might set it to the United States, we might set it to Australia. What defines whether it's fair or unfair place setting is the context in which the debate occurs. So if it's a national tournament and you set the debate as being about Australia, that's okay. If it's an international tournament and you're in South Korea debating against people from Japan, and you said it was about being a debate in Australia, some people might say that's unfair because you're seeking to use the place setting to gain an unfair advantage over your opponents. But the test about whether something's unfair or not is really about whether or not it's reasonable to believe that your opponents should know enough about that place to do the debate, not whether they do know enough about that place to do the debate. So if the topic was that we should create a new state, if you define that debate as being about Israel and we should create a new Palestinian state, even if your opponents say, oh, that's totally unfair, that's so hard, we don't know anything about Israel and Palestine, bad luck, right? Because it's in the media all the time. It's an issue that even if you actually don't know anything about it, you know that it's an issue, you know it's there, you know it's your fault, you don't know anything about it, so bad luck. But if it was defined as that we should create a new state in the Nagorno-Karabakh region between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which has been disputed for nigh on 15 years now, then what you're trying to do pretty clearly is show off. Like I just did there, and it was right. In a debate that's pretty unfair, you're seeking to kind of take advantage of your opponents, and that's not very cool. So you are allowed to place it, just make sure you're doing it because you want to have a better debate that's focused on particular issues, not you're just trying to screw people over. Okay, down to first principles. Once you've got the right definition, now you need to do the right debate. So let's start with the basic stuff. Now I want to be clear, first principles does not mean you do not need to read or know stuff. Okay? I've never in my life discouraged people from reading or knowing stuff. Just ask people who have been hassled to read and know stuff by me for many, many years. Okay? So I know there's this persistent rumour out there that first principles is the opposite of knowing stuff. It is not the opposite of knowing stuff. It is firstly a way to kind of do the best job you can in debates while you're still new, while you're still learning about issues and ideas, and it's a way of making sure you get the maximum leverage out of the things you know, making sure that you use them most effectively. Okay? It's not about knowing nothing. In fact, we just saw from that definitional discussion that if you don't even read basic amounts and things like getting the context of debate right are virtually impossible. So you must read, you must know stuff, but in the meantime, this will help you, particularly in the early couple of months and particularly this year. So, what are basic first principles? Basic first principles are making sure that the debate is set up to have a good, clear clash, and that you clearly identify what side of that clash you're on and what side of that clash your opponents are on, and helps you understand what kinds of arguments you will make in that debate. To put that another way, it's understanding that most debates, the vast majority of debates, break down into a certain number of debate types. So here's where I'm going to try and be cool, even trendy, which once you say that you can't possibly be cool. So like, right? With iPhone games. Have you ever noticed how basically most iPhone games are actually exactly the same? So there's like those ones where you defend the castle and you flick away the little guys who are coming at you, and yeah, they're a bit different, but really they're all the same. And then there's the kind of Dungeons and Dragons ones where you run around and you kill stuff and you get like gold and stuff, and then you buy like the magic helmet for your guy. Then there's like the Tetris type ones, and etc., right? So when you really boil it down, it's actually only about 10 games on the iPhone. Some of them look nicer than others, some of them cost more than others, some of them are more fun than others, but the engine and the core idea, the core kind of challenge of that game is actually really the same as shitloads of other games. That's what debates are like. Okay? They seem superficially to be different, but actually the vast majority of them are all based on the same kind of clash, the same tension, the same problem, the same limitations for one side against the other. If you can identify that early on, then you already know how to play the game. You know what the rules are, you know what you're likely to be able to do, you know what the strategy is to play that game well. So, in the most basic terms, the vast majority of debates that you're going to get at ISA in the next 6 months fall into 3 categories. The first one is a trade-off. And a trade-off debate is where the choices, the ideas that the two sides are debating are both inherently objectively good. Which means that any reasonable person would think that both teams are arguing for something of value. The problem is, it's a zero-sum game. You can't maximise both of those good things. You have to trade off how much of one of those good things you have against the other. You can't have 100% of both. So what's a classic example of that? Well, the easy one is role of government debates, because you get lots of them all the time. And really, when you're asking yourself about what is the role of government, when you boil it all down to the simplest, most basic dilemma, the dilemma of government is accountability versus efficiency. Now, everybody thinks both of those things are good things. Efficiency is a slightly cold way of putting it, but what I mean by that is that the government can get things done. The government can do stuff. It has the capacity to pass laws, to change things, to exercise its will. Now, maybe it will exercise its will in ways you don't like, but that's okay if you're talking about democracies. You'll get your chance to punish them later. But at its core, there's very few people out there, except kind of radical anarchists, who like the idea of a government that's completely gridlocked and incapable of doing anything in anyone's interests. Most people would like to see government be able to achieve something, maybe just not everything it wants to do. But also most people think the idea of accountable government is a good idea, but it kind of seems a bit odd that in a democracy where people are supposed to be in charge and the government's supposed to serve you, you should have more than one say every 3 or 4 years in how that government goes. You should get a little bit more kind of say in how things go. Now there has to be a limit to that, right? Because the logical extension of that is you should get a decision about everything. And you can have that kind of radical participatory democracy, but it's messy and it's ineffective. So if you want to have 22 million people decide every day about every one of the hundreds of issues that every government makes a decision about, well that's fine, but most of those decisions aren't going to get made. Just think about the fact that the vast majority of referenda in Australia fail, mostly because people don't understand them, and so when they don't understand them, they vote no. Well, I can tell you from my time in government, the vast majority of decisions that get made are so arcane or so boring that it's next to impossible to get the public to understand them, let alone to pay attention to them, let alone give up their time to vote on them. So there has to be a trade-off, there has to be a limit. You can't have the public make every decision because you don't want them to make none. So where do you draw the line? That's a whole plethora of debates. Simple example is a topic you'll get at Easters and internal competitions alike, something like that we should abolish the Senate. Now, why is that a trade-off debate? Not because you might like or hate the Senate, although you might, but because the Senate's there to perform a role. The Senate's job is to be a body of accountability. Its job is to slow things down. Its existence is about making it harder for the government to pass laws, even if that's just about time, right? Even in a situation where the government of the day controls both the lower house and the upper house, like say in Victoria, or soon most likely to be the case in New South Wales, or federally under the last term of the Howard government, even in those cases where the government controlled both houses, the process of having two houses of parliament slows things down. There are committee processes, there are layovers, there are investigations, there are question times, right? A bill has to wait 2 weeks minimum between when it's passed by the lower house before it can be debated in the upper house. So that immediately slows things down and prevents the government from just using its numbers to get its own way. Now, that's either a good thing or a bad thing depending on your perspective, but at the very least, it's an extra level of accountability at the cost of some level of effectiveness. Now, if you're the kind of person who thinks you'd like to have more accountability and less effectiveness, that's fine. Does that mean you want a third house of parliament? Maybe you do. Does it mean you want a fourth or a fifth? At some point you're going to stop, you're going to say too much. Now we've gone too far, now the government can't get anything done. Where do you draw the line? Okay, that's the trade-off. Now, the reason why it's important to recognise this is because just the language I've used to talk about this type of debate tells you a lot about the kinds of arguments you'll make. It's not the kind of debate where you're going to be screaming across the table about what an immoral jerk your opponents are. Right? Because you're admitting they have a point. Yes, the thing they want is good. Yes, it's intrinsically valuable. Yes, in a perfect world we would have lots of that. But you just can't. The nature of the choice is zero-sum. You have to trade. That tells you something about the kind of debate you do. Second type of debate is a values debate, which funnily enough is the opposite to a trade-off debate. It's where the two sides are arguing for things which objectively it would be unlikely that someone would support both. The two ideas aren't necessarily diametrically opposed, but they are mutually exclusive. So, the simplest example of this is the oldest debate in democracy, which is the left philosophy versus the right philosophy, which is big government versus small government. It's pretty hard to imagine someone who supports both. Okay, kind of logically, you have to sit at least slightly to one side of that equation than the other. And the further down one path you go, the more you dislike the other side of that equation. Now, that means that debate's a different type of debate, where you're not accepting that your opponents have a point. You're not accepting that in a perfect world you would give them much of what they want. You just can't. In fact, you're saying in a perfect world you people wouldn't exist. In a perfect world you'd be smart enough not to be that kind of person. You'd be more like us. Whichever side of the debate that you're on. And a shitload of debates fall into that big government versus small government category. And we've talked about a few, right? So things like gambling laws, things like freedom of speech laws, right? All of these things, gun laws, drugs, prostitution, etc., are all at their heart big government versus small government debates. And so if you understand that clash and the type of people you have to be on one side of the debate or the other, then regardless of which of those topics you get, you know which sort of arguments you have to make and what the kind of arguments your opponent's going to make out. The last one's the hardest one to explain really briefly, but I'll do my best, which is cookie cutters. And cookie cutters are the kinds of debates where, although they might seem to be on completely different issues, it's actually the same arguments over and over again that get repeated. So the classic ones of these are the ban versus regulate topics, right? The social vice debates. What do we do about this bad stuff? What do we do about drugs? What do we do about prostitution? What do we do about guns and gambling? So these are debates where both sides usually, though not always, will admit that there's potential problem or harm to be caused by this particular industry or thing. But the question is, how do we best manage that? And is the way we best manage that by reducing access to it by as much as we possibly can? And we do that by banning it. So technically, drugs are illegal in Australia. Technically, I mean, most of you, if you really wanted to, could go out and find most things you could imagine that are out there right now. But access is actually limited by the fact that they're illegal, not necessarily in the practical sense that they're not available, but they're limited in the sense that you don't want to go into the circumstances you would have to go into to get them. You know the kind of people you would have to deal with largely to get those things are not people you particularly want to hang out with, and in places you particularly want to be. And they're not in a way in which you can trust very well what you're getting. So that does limit your access because it reduces your trust and your faith and your interest in pursuing the product. Whereas with something like smoking, we haven't reduced the access that much. You know if you go and buy a pack of cigarettes, you're going to get what the label says. Now whether you buy it or not is up to you, but the access is quite freely available for adults. So which one of those strategies best reduces the harm? The one where we legalise it, but put conditions and rules around it, put labels on the packages, create standards for that product to make sure that they're not too much of one thing and not too little of the other. And that might mean that more people might use that product, but a lower level of harm done to each person who does use it. Or is it better to ban it, where less people overall will use it, but there'll be more potential harm to each person who does? They're all exactly the same debate, on exactly the same rules, right? Just different issues. Does that make sense? Now, for those of you that are the first years in the room and have never been to a tournament this year, that's really all I want you to get out of today, is what we've talked about so far. If you follow anything that's about to happen next, that's awesome, but this is the key, right? If you can look at topics and straight away start to decide which one of these they are and what that means, which side of the debate you're on, I promise you'll be light years ahead of most of the teams, most of the speakers at Easters. For this reason, most novice teams miss the point, right? They just say a whole lot of random, unpersuasive shit. Now, you, I'm sorry to say, will also spend a lot of your speeches saying random, unpersuasive shit. But here's the catch, right? The more time you spend actually talking about, even if it's by luck, by chance, by fluke, the more time you spend kind of in that key clash, talking, just by pure fluke of nature, talking about the right issue, the chance of victory for your team goes up dramatically. And the more time you spend outside of the core issues of the debate, the more the adjudicator thinks about killing themselves and everyone else in the room. I'm here to tell you the truth, folks. It's just how it is. So, if you can just find the right core of the debate and spend as much time as you can in that core, developing your team's understanding of it as much as you can, you will dramatically increase your chance of success. I know that sounds unlikely, but believe me, it's true. That's the whole reason why I waste all this time telling this stuff to people, because it works. So, any questions about that before we move on? Okay, so let's just take that a little bit deeper. I know some of you have said this before, so we're going to move really quickly. Once you know what kind of case you're doing, you need a model to actually explain what in practice you're going to do about that problem. How you're going to take the principles of big government or small government, or the principle of wanting to have a more accountable system rather than a more efficient system. How you're going to make it real. How you're going to make it actually change people's lives. And for that, you need a model. Now, how much detail do you need in your model? Well, a friend of mine, Kim Little, used to say that You need enough detail that a reasonable person could understand things they need to know about that model, not so much that you're wasting time on stuff which doesn't really matter. So when you're getting to the point where people are saying what colour pen are you going to use to write that law and how many pages are going to be, you're wasting time. But when you're at the point where people are asking fundamental questions which might actually change their mind about whether they support that idea or not, then it's important to clarify those things. So if you're going to do a debate about legalising marijuana, it doesn't really matter how much a serving of marijuana will cost. Right? It doesn't really matter whether it's going to be $5 or $10 or $20. But it does matter whether you're going to legalise it for people who are 16, 18, 21, 35, or some other age. Because there are people who might say, yeah, okay, I don't mind the idea of adults doing it, but I don't want 16-year-olds to be able to get access to it. I don't want 14-year-olds to be able to use it. So those kind of decisions might change someone's support for your model, but the other things don't, so they don't really matter to you today. So here's a quick idea. Most models can be described as being either soft line or hard line, or somewhere in the middle. That doesn't relate to how difficult they are to defend in a debate, okay? Actually, it's usually the other way around. The harder the line you take, often the easier it is to defend. What I mean by hard and soft is, how different are they from the status quo? If your model is very similar to the status quo, then it's a soft case. If it's very different from the status quo, then it's a hard case. Now, sometimes that graph for a given topic should actually have soft in the middle and hard on either ends. Right? Because there are extreme, dramatic changes you could make in both directions. Right? More liberalising or more shutting down of that option. Sometimes it's like that, where the soft line is on one end and you can only move in one direction away from the status quo. So something like, say, seatbelt laws. Not that you'd ever debate something as prosaic as this, but if the topic was that we should abolish seatbelt laws, there's nowhere else to go, right? We've already got basically the hardest model there is, which is compulsory to wear seatbelts all the time, no matter what your age is, right? There's nowhere else to go. So the debate only flows in one direction. How much would you remove that law? How much would you change that restriction? Okay, but other laws act differently. So, in the case of this example, which is euthanasia, here are the three kind of classic euthanasia models. The soft line is to say, we would allow people to have access to euthanasia, but only those that are really, really, really sick and really, really, really close to death. I mean, so close to death, they might actually die while we're talking about how they should die. I don't know what you're laughing about, it's a terrible thing. Secondly, we'd say we need a huge number of checks and balances. First and foremost, we need to know that they actually are inflicted with a terminal illness, that actually have no hope of recovery or cure or stabilisation of their illness. So we need multiple doctors to make sure, because any one doctor could get it wrong. And then secondly, we need to know that they're of sound enough mind that they can make this most important of decisions, that the drugs haven't affected, the painkillers they're on haven't affected the way they think, or the pain or the suffering that they're enduring as part of their illness hasn't changed their capacity to make rational decisions. And again, we're not going to trust one person to make that decision because it's too important. We need multiple psychologists to confirm that for us. And then, even if you pass all of those tests, when we say euthanasia, we mean passive euthanasia, which means the denial of treatment and food. Right? Nothing active. Right? No syringe in the arm that kills you. Just no more medicine, no more food until you die. Now, the reason why that's a soft model is you can see quite obviously very few people are going to get access to this. Firstly, because very few people are going to meet the first test of being so close to being dead that they're basically dead but not dead yet. Because if you're that close to being dead, you're probably going to be dead pretty soon. So by the time you go through all the other stuff, you're already dead. The second test is obviously hard too. How are you going to find multiple doctors who are prepared to say absolutely that there's no hope for you and that absolutely you definitely are of sound enough mind to make this decision? That's pretty hard. And then finally, even if you can pass all those tests, the actual offering itself is not very appealing. Right? The idea of starving to death slowly is not a great way for you or your loved ones to end their days. So even if you could pass those first two tests, you might think twice about it. So it's a soft model because very few people get any benefit from it. It's a very small change from the status quo. The further down the line you go, the more you open up that access. But the more you open up the access, the more you open up the risk. Right? So by the time you get to the hard line, you're saying not just people who are very close to death, but just people who are diagnosed with an illness that's degenerative and debilitative. Because this is about quality of life, right? Yep. It's about quality of life, right? If the first model, the soft line, is about saying no one should have to suffer intensely, they should be helped, then why does it matter whether that suffering is just physical? Why wouldn't you extend it to the fear of the neurological debilitation that you're going to suffer? I mean, I don't know about you, and this might come as a surprise to many of you in this room, but I'm actually a massive geek. And as a massive non-jock, non-mad soccer playing geek, I'm actually much more worried about losing my mind and my memory and my cognitive skills than I am about losing control over my admittedly fabulous body. So if you said to me, Tim, you've got cancer, you've got 6 months, sucks to be you, that would be bad, right? But at least I would know I can still enjoy all the things that most matter to me, my intellectual life. I can enjoy books and music and movies, and I can enjoy mocking people who are less intelligent than me. And that will help me get through what's left of my life. But if you said, Tim, you're as healthy as you're ever going to be, but 6 months from now you're not going to remember who you are, where you're from, anything you've done or read, anyone you've ever seen, and most importantly, all the girls you've ever seen naked. You're going to forget all of those things. But you're going to be fine, right? You might live another 20, 30, 40 years. There's nothing wrong with your body, but your mind is irreparably broken. Well, under the first model, there's nothing you can do about that, right? Because you're not going to die. You're not very close to death. In fact, you might be a long way off being dead. But the same logic might apply to say, if I decide I actually don't want to be me, if I'm not the kind of person who remembers who I am and what makes me me, if after that point I don't want to be alive anymore, well, then isn't that kind of suffering equally valid? But once you open that door, it's more logically consistent, but the risks are huge. Firstly, you're including people who by definition have a degree of intellectual impairment. Right? You're admitting that these are people who are losing their memory, who are losing their minds, and you're going to allow them to make the most important choice they could make, which is to die. You know, it's the most important choice because you can't undo it. So you're allowing these people who you admit are impaired to make this choice. So the risks are huge. But if you can carry off the case, if you can justify it, if you can say that checks and balances will be enough, then the value of your model expands dramatically. So many more thousands, tens of thousands of people get the benefit of your model. So those are the risk and reward balances. Right? Yeah.
Out of curiosity, in that risk and reward balance, if you were up against a team that you either knew was stronger than you or weaker than you, would you lean more to against a hard model if you would get someone you knew was better than you and would tear it apart more easily?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a very common kind of strategic question that faces teams. I reckon first and foremost, in any given circumstance, so putting the question aside for just a second, you almost always want to be here. Right? You want to be somewhere between the moderate and the hard. It's hardly ever of any value to you to be deeply in the soft line territory, for the simple reason that you can't establish a serious problem and do anything about it. At best, you can establish an unimportant problem and then make small efforts to achieve that, but there's no guts to the debate, right? And after your first speaker said all that stuff, there's really nowhere left to go, so you kind of run out of steam. So I think it's pretty unhelpful. But to answer your specific question, no, I wouldn't change my case based on how strong I thought my opponents were. I would always build my case based on, first and foremost, what I thought my team was best placed to defend. So depending on the experience and the knowledge and the skills of your teammates, that would determine kind of where you were in that spectrum. But look, if it's one very weak team against another very weak team, you might think the differences between, well, what can my teammates do might be very marginal. Don't give in to the temptation to run a soft line just because you think it will be hard to attack. Yes, it will be hard to attack, but it also makes it almost impossible for you to attack your opponents, which just means you'll lose in a more frustrating way, rather than losing in an actual fair fight where you throw as many punches as they do. Because adjudicators hate soft lines because it wastes their time. Okay, does that make sense? So in every debate where you need a model, which is about 99% of them, you need to think about where your model is, make sure you understand whether it's soft or hard, because that changes the kinds of arguments that you make. So how do you know if it's soft or hard? Well, you need to know a few of these things. I'm going to move through these things really quickly, but trends, norms and tipping points are the last form of kind of basic analysis that you'll do. So trends are really simple. Trends are, what's the direction of public policy? What's happening? So, on an issue like, say, let's do a simple one. Smoking. What's the trend on laws about smoking in Australia?
More restrictive.
Right. Every year that goes by, laws become more restrictive. There's hardly any evidence or any examples of where governments in Australia in the last 20 or 30 years have relaxed any restrictions that they've placed on cigarettes. If anything, they make them more. They make them higher costs. They allow you to smoke them in less places. They make the packaging more restrictive, etc., etc. And those trends are continuing. Right? Very clear, very obvious trend. Norms, of course, trends can change, right, and that's important. So if you look at, say, financial management, right, if you look at economic and financial laws, before the global financial crisis, the trend was all one way. The trend was towards deregulation, right, going back 20, 30 years of relaxing the restrictions on financial institutions to let them do more and more things. The classic example of that is what's called the Glass-Steagall Act, which meant that banks, the kind of banks that you and I have our deposits in. The technical term for them is banks that accept deposits from individuals and that hold mortgages, had to be functionally separate from financial institutions whose sole and principal function was to speculate on financial markets. So if you wanted to invest your money in the stock market or in shares or derivatives or other fun and exotic things, then you had to give that to a different organisation than you would give your pay packet to, and you would expect to hold your mortgage. For the simple reason that if one crashed, the other wouldn't. That if the gambling, the one side did went badly wrong, you wouldn't lose your house, and vice versa. But the Glass-Steagall Act was abolished during the Clinton administration, which meant that banks and financial institutions could merge into these gigantic financial institutions that did both. It's a classic example of deregulation. After the 2008 global financial crisis, the trend has been back the other way, right? For governments to be re-regulating, to be putting new restrictions back on. So knowing that direction of the trends is important to understanding where your case fits, how hard and soft it is. Second thing is norms. Norms tell you what society accepts, right? Norms tell you what the public think is reasonable. And I heard a great example of this morning on my way to work, which was there was discussion on ABC Radio, because that's what I listen to, about the debate over the pokie machine regulation. They had a guy on from the tobacco industry, from the gambling industry, from the Hoteliers Association, talking about why the government shouldn't be allowed to place new restrictions on people using poker machines. And he said, well, the standard in Australia is people like to gamble, right? People like to have a gamble on the horse races, people like to buy Tats Lotto tickets, people like to have a punt every now and then, people like to throw the dice in a casino, and yet they like to go into a pub and play a bit of pokies. What he was clearly doing there was establishing the norm, right? He was saying, this thing that's controversial actually isn't controversial because it's a lot like these other things that aren't controversial. So if you don't think it's controversial that people like to have a bit of a bet on the horses on Melbourne Cup Day, or like to go into the casino and throw $10 on black and see what comes up on a roulette wheel, if you don't think that's controversial, then you shouldn't think this is controversial. He's using one norm to justify another norm. It's very smart strategy. The final one is about tipping points. Now, what tipping points do is they help you to take something that seems difficult and controversial and make it seem more likely and more acceptable. So the simple example here would be something like, say, overthrowing Kim Jong-il in North Korea. Now, you'll often get topics, because topic selectors think they're being very kind of clever and muscular by setting topics like that we should overthrow the North Korean regime, or we should, assassinate, the leader of Zimbabwe, or whatever other kind of crazy exotic idea they have. And yeah, it's fun to set, and there's sort of 2 minutes of kind of aggressive, table-thumping rhetoric, but then you're stuck with the gut-wrenching problem of actually showing how your model's going to do anything good for anyone other than sound good for a few minutes. And it's hard, right? Particularly in the case of, say, North Korea, because the country, to be fair, is pretty screwed up. Right? And we've pretty much tried everything over the last 50 years to try to get some change in North Korea, and nothing really works, which means that both sides are probably going to struggle to show that their model does anything, but that's not really much comfort to you because you have to actually get through 8 minutes of your speech. So what do? Well, you can completely ignore all of this stuff, you can ignore the trends and the tipping points, and just make a case and say, well, we think if we, sent in special forces and they assassinated Kim Jong-il because they're just that awesome, and they could do that, and we're not worried about that, then what would happen is that the North Korean public would rise up like the people of Egypt did and take over the regime. It would all be that simple. Well, that's going to be pretty hard to prove. It's pretty hard to prove that you can actually effectively assassinate him, and that if you did, the regime wouldn't just recover and go on as other regimes have when their leaders die or move on. But with tipping point analysis, you can help, because what tipping point analysis is all about is showing that one more thing will be the straw that breaks the camel's back. One more change will be added to all the trends that have been building up to create some new change. And it's a lot like the norm setting exercise, right, about making something difficult seem easy. So in the case of North Korea, instead of allowing people, as most people normally think of North Korea as this sort of frozen, solid kind of dictatorship where nothing ever changes and there's no hope for anything, use tipping point analysis to say that's not the case. And the example that would be, say, something along the lines of, late last year when most of you guys were getting pissed and thinking about what to buy for Christmas, some pretty big things were happening in North Korea. And the first one was this. The North Korean government had decided that there had been far too much development of private black market industries in North Korea. And they were worried about that because the existence of black markets meant that there were people who were gaining financial wealth and power and significance in North Korean society who weren't being controlled directly by the regime. That's a very dangerous thing when you're a repressive regime. So they wanted to crack down on those black markets. They also wanted to crack down on them because the existence of black markets undermined the argument that's central to the North Korean regime, which is you don't need democracy, you don't need choice, You don't need any control because the regime provides the food and the basic material needs that you have. And the existence of these black markets is evidence that's not true. If people had all their basic needs met, they wouldn't be risking their lives and their freedom going out to black markets to buy, eggs and frying pans. But they're doing it because if they don't, they'll die. So the government came up with a very clever plan for dealing with the black market. Rather than running around trying to shoot people, which is messy and slow, they decided they'd just change the currency. So they redenominated North Korea's currency. They announced it overnight and said, we're going to change the currency by removing 2 zeros from every banknote in the country. And here's the deal. There's a limited amount of money that you're allowed to exchange for the new currency. If you happen to have more than that, well, you shouldn't have more than that, so it shouldn't really matter, should it? So that meant all the people who only had tiny amounts of money went to their whatever Bank of North Korea is in exchange for their new completely worthless currency, and life went on. But for those who had managed to scrimp and save and keep money under their pillow for a time in the future when they might need it to buy a potato, those people were pretty screwed. And obviously those people who had amassed something approaching a significant amount of money running these black market fairs were completely screwed because all their money overnight became completely worthless because you can't trade North Korean currency outside of North Korea and the government was about to abolish it. So those people were trapped. Now, very cunning, very smart. The problem was it worked exactly as intended. It completely crippled the black market. The people didn't respond to that by saying, well, the good times couldn't last forever. They responded to that by saying, now we're going to starve to death. We're not really okay with that, and started riots and protests in a number of North Korean cities. Just an unprecedented thing to happen. The government ended up getting more worried about the protests of the public that had never been seen before than they were about the black market, so they apologised for changing the currency, and just so you knew they meant it, they took the finance minister and publicly executed him. It's all in the New York Times, people. I don't know why you're not surprised. So, once you've got a bit of context for the debate, and you can see how the trends are changing in North Korean society, you can say, this is a society that's a powder keg. This is a society that's very angry, where the people are very angry at the regime in an unprecedented way. And they've already taken the risk of protesting publicly, which has never been seen before in the last 56 odd years of North Korean history. The public are looking for change. Now is the time for the West and the free world to go in and help them out because the people will react. They've proven it. They're organised, they're ready, they just need that last help. And so what we're going to do is we're going to bomb Kim Jong-il's palace and we're going to try and kill him and as many of his leaders as we can. And in the ensuing chaos, we're confident the public will take that chance and rise up. Now, the practicalities of that may not be any better or worse than what I described before, but it goes from being an incredibly impossible sounding case to being something that actually sounds like it just might be crazy enough to work. Now bear in mind, I'm not suggesting it's a great case, but I'm saying if that's the topic, you've got to do the best you can with that topic, and this is the best way to do it. Does that all make sense? Okay, I'm going to plow on. Now for the hard stuff. So, for versions of the room, if you don't follow much of this, it doesn't really matter. Intermediate first principles. When you have matter sessions in MAD, largely what you're going to get taught by people is intermediate first principles. I don't say that as a criticism, I say that's the level of training, and that's because most debaters in MAD are intermediate or lower, just by definition. So this is really useful stuff. And it's a big improvement on basic first principles because the problem of basic first principles is obvious. It's far too crude. It's far too simple to suggest that all debates about the role of government are really just this black or white, one or the other, trade-off versus values debate thing. Obviously, if you've done a bit of debating, you know that's not true, that there's a great deal of nuance and subtlety and sophistication that's completely lost by that analysis. Now, that doesn't mean that basic first principles is a waste of time. What it does for debaters who have very limited experience is give them simple, usable, practical tips for making sure their cases are logically consistent and clear, that they define a clear clash in the debate. That's shitloads better than the waffling crap where people don't talk about the topic, which you talked about before. But once you've got a bit more experience and a bit more knowledge, that's very unhelpful, and that level of crudeness will actually hurt you against more sophisticated teams rather than help you. So, what do? Well, you need more options, you need more ideas. Instead of seeing the debate as just being a choice between one thing and the other, you need third, fourth, fifth, sixth options. And the way you do that is by seeing debates not as being a choice between one thing or another, but as being a debate about a spectrum of ideas. And so in every discipline, whether it's economics or environmentalism or feminism or whatever academic disciplines you might study or might be interested in, all of the different views that can be represented within that individual field can, if you like, be expressed diagrammatically as a spectrum. where people who have one particular view about that issue cluster towards one end of the spectrum, and those who disagree with some of the fundamental premises of that worldview cluster to the other end. Now, to take economics as a relatively simple example, most of you would probably have heard terms like Keynesianism, government intervention, and neoliberalism and free markets. If you haven't heard those things, boy, is this year going to be tough for you. So, the choice there is largely between those who see that there is a legitimate role for government to intervene in the economy, that it is legitimate for the government to try to resolve problems of supply and demand, that it is legitimate for the government to try to tackle inefficiencies and market barriers and market failures, and those who think all that stuff's bunkum, and actually the government should get the hell out of the way, and the more the government tries to help, it just harms, and they hire dumb people anyway. Now, obviously, when I say things like it's legitimate for the government to intervene in the economy, there's huge shades of grey in that. Right? There are those who say, yeah, the government should intervene a lot. The government should get involved every time there's a problem. It should get involved in all kinds of levels of economic transactions. Then there are those who say, well, yeah, okay, but maybe the government should only get involved in limited circumstances or issues of particular significance or seriousness or issues that occur at the state level or the federal level or the international level. Now, depending on how hardcore you are about your government interventionism, depends on how far down the line you are as a Keynesian. I'm using that as quite a crude term, right? Not everybody who has these views would like the term Keynesian, but it'll do for now. Some people who say, well, no, government shouldn't really intervene and they're pretty crap at it anyway and the market will sort itself out and all that's cool. Not everybody holds that view in the way that, say, the Institute of Public Affairs do, who will answer every question with, what should we do about X, with we should deregulate it. There's another group of people who might be more here, who might say, yeah, I think by and large markets are a better solution to these problems than government intervention, but maybe not always. Maybe there are circumstances in which the government should get involved, like the global financial crisis. There are a lot of people who consider themselves neoliberals, like, they're heads of the world's biggest financial institutions, who then turned up to government and said, we'd like a shitload of government intervention, please. So even some of those people decided there was a limit to their free market thinking. Now, why is that helpful? Because once you establish the spectrum, you can start to figure out what are the spaces between the extremes. What are the important differences? Now, there's really no point worrying about how much difference is there between this point on the line and this point on the line. There would be a meaningful academic distinction between that, but in the context of a debate, largely it'll break down into 2, 3, sometimes 4 or 5 positions. That's about it. The differences between anything more than that are too small to be significant. But as you can figure out what those differences are, you start to see what are the options for us in building a case. What are the options for our models? What are the options for the kinds of arguments that we make? Now, how do you do that? Well, I've given you sort of 2 quick tests here. The first is by thinking about it logically, by asking yourself, what are the options that should exist? And when it comes to the economy, the big clash is, as I've already answered the question, between those who think the government should get involved and those who think the government shouldn't get involved. Even if you've never studied economics, if you've read like a little bit of anything, and if you've done half a dozen debates that involve economics, you should be aware that that's a clash. Once you've identified that as the core options, you can then start to do reading and do research to plug the gaps. So once you've located what you know, identify the things you don't know. Let's do an example. Well, let's jump on, we'll do an example back to the next slide. Because that's pretty obvious, right? That's pretty easy stuff. Most of you who have seen intermediate first principles know it. Now, the advanced first principle stuff is the next step. And surprise, surprise, advanced first principles exist because intermediate first principles is too simplistic. So, yes, basic first principles is pretty crude. To suggest that every debate's black or white is pretty much the definition of what's crude. Intermediate first principle says, well, maybe there aren't 2 choices, maybe there are 3 or 5. Yep, that's a pretty big improvement. Advanced first principle says, maybe there aren't 3 or 5 options, maybe there's 300 or 500 options. And the difference is that people in the real world don't actually believe and exist and behave the way that ideologies as mapped on a first principle spectrum would tell them to behave. I mean, yeah, there are some guys at the Institute of Public Affairs who operate exactly the way that neoliberalism tells them to, and there's a few unreformed communists who are the same at the other end. But the vast majority of real people actually have a much more nuanced view of policy, and while they might broadly say, yeah, I'm this kind of person or that kind of person, the reason why they say broadly is because there are exceptions to the way they think, and some important exceptions. Now, in classic philosophical terms, those exceptions are logical inconsistencies. Right? It's logically inconsistent to say, I support free markets, except when a big bank needs to be bailed out, then I think my bank should be bailed out. That's logically inconsistent, and in theory you would think you would be punished for that. But the reasons why people, well-thinking people, not morons, the reason why people who have thought through their exception are important, and the reason why they're the highest level of first principles, is because the reason why you make that exception is usually a very powerful reason. Right? It's usually the kind of argument that says, I'm generally very persuaded by this way of thinking, but for a very specific reason, I make exceptions in these cases. And if you know why they make that exception, you have yourself a very powerful argument. Now, usually the reason why they make that exception is because they realise that in a practical, real-world sense, their philosophy in at least a given area doesn't hold up. Right? And that's usually because of their experience of those things. And those kind of arguments are much more potent than just saying, well, your argument's logically inconsistent. Now, the quote I put up here is just because I think Chris Rock is awesome, and the point he's making there, although it's obviously for the sake of comedy, is the same point that advanced first principles about, which is that in the real world, what if you lived in a kind of intermediate first principles world, you'd live in the world of like the fucked up mentality of gangs that Chris Rock is railing against here, where everyone's in a gang. They're Republicans or Democrats, they're Keynesians or they're free marketeers, they're on the left or they're on the right. And a world like that would be a pretty frustrating, annoying world. But luckily, we don't. We live in a world of people who are like Chris Rock, who says, on some shit, I'm conservative, and on some shit, I'm liberal. And that's what the real world is like. Let's do an example. So, environmentalism, which I'm going to come back and talk to you about on the weekend. I'm not going to spend huge amounts of time explaining the spectrum, but if you looked at it from an intermediate first principles point of view, you would get that spectrum at the top. And this is what I'll teach you on the weekend. Where the broad spectrum here, as you can see, there are 3 points, because like most intermediate first principle spectrums, they're usually 3s or 5s. The 3 key points here is, on the far left, I mean that literally and metaphorically, the far left is deep green ecology. These are like your hippies. And what differentiates them from others is they think that their health and sustainability of the earth comes first and must be immediate. We have to shape human civilization, we have to shape our economy and society to fit within environmental parameters, not the other way around. Right? They're against consumption, right? Not all the way, they want to eat food and breathe there too, but they're against the idea that increasing consumption is the way to go. That increasing consumption, as in increasing GDP growth, is a sign of a healthy economy. They see it as a sign of an economy that's in trouble, in the same way that an increasing number of parasites is a bad thing, not a good thing. The second position is sustainable development, and these guys take a more balanced view of things, who say, yep, we'd like to get to the point in the future where we live within environmental bounds, but we've kind of got problems right now, like people who are starving to death, and so what we're going to do is we're going to try to, as much as we can, put the Earth in as far forward a position as we can, but not necessarily always put it ahead of human needs. These are people who are a bit agnostic about the question of growth. Yeah, growth is probably important in the short term, but maybe in the long term it'd be nice if we lived in an economy where we didn't need it. And then finally is technological ecology, and these are people who are pro-growth, pro-technology, who think the way you deal with environmental problems is to elevate people out of poverty, is to build material wealth, to develop new technologies, and that those things will help reduce your footprint on things. So a simple example would be, deep green ecologists say, when it comes to cars, efficiency is not enough. Right? If we want to reduce the amount of oil that we burn and therefore the amount of pollution that we create, you have to reduce the number of people who are in cars. Even though, as a technological ecologist will tell you, cars are much more fuel efficient now than they were 20 years ago. That's true. There's also much, much, much more cars than there were 20 years ago, which means the efficiency gain is being completely overwhelmed by the increase in consumption, which is why we use more oil today than we used 20 years ago. So you can't win this race by just increasing the speed of the efficiency treadmill. You have to actually change the game completely. Technological ecologists will say, well, that's nonsense. Right, that we've achieved some amazing things through technology, and the classic one is air quality, and you only have to look at Melbourne, and the EPA publish these stats every year about what is the air quality in the Melbourne CBD, which is really just a function of the cars that drive through them. They're the single biggest determinant of air quality, along with weather and atmospheric conditions. And despite the fact the population of Melbourne has increased dramatically over the last 10 years, the number of cars that have been driven has increased dramatically, the air quality in Melbourne is largely the same, if not slightly better. Why is that? Because we drive cleaner cars that burn less fuel, they burn those fuels more cleanly, and the fuels themselves are cleaner, like we don't have lead burning fuel anymore, everyone drives unleaded cars, we have catalytic converters, we have fuels that are better refined, etc., which means even though there are more cars, there's less or the same pollution. That's a pretty amazing achievement. Now, that's all fine, and you can get through the vast majority of environmental debate if you can understand that. I go into more detail, but I don't have time. That's fine. But once you're against a team that actually know that and more, you're in trouble. But more to the point, you'll find situations where that understanding of first principles creates less options than you would like. And the classic example here is nuclear power. And based on that logic, intermediate first principles would say if you're a team that has to be pro-nuclear, you cannot be a deep green ecologist. Because it's inconsistent with their philosophy. Right? You can't say we should reduce growth, we should live within our limits, we shouldn't use finite resources, we should only use renewable resources, and we should try to consume less. At the same time say we should dig uranium, which is a limited resource, out of the ground, we should burn it so we can have really cheap power so we can fuel our economies. Right? It doesn't work very well, which is why, surprise, surprise, the biggest opponents of nuclear power are hardcore environmentalists. Right? No shocks about that, because that's where their philosophy takes them and tells them to go. So intermediate first principles would say you can maybe be a sustainable development type person if you want when you're defending nuclear power. You're probably going to be some kind of technological ecologist. What advanced first principles about worldviews tells you is there are actually worldviews that can consistently hold deep green ecology with the support for nuclear power. And some of the biggest deep green ecologists in the world, like Patrick Moore, who was co-founder of Greenpeace, and like George Monbiot, who's a writer for The Guardian and a well-known environmentalist, written several books on kind of what are effectively deep green ecology, although he doesn't like the label, are both people who recently, or for a very long time, in the case of Patrick Moore, support nuclear power. Now, how do they do that? It's not because they just create some kind of firewall in their brain where they don't realise that what they support is completely irrational. They do it because the reason why they support nuclear power actually fits within a more nuanced understanding of deep green ecology. And the simple argument is climate change. Right? These guys say that, yeah, if climate change didn't exist, if it was a problem that had never been found or was, could be magically resolved through waving a wand, we'd be totally against nuclear power. It's completely shit. But in a world where we have climate change and we need to, as rapidly as possible, decarbonise our energy systems, we need to replace coal and gas and oil as quickly as we can, nuclear is the best bet. And because there is no deep green ecology if we don't tackle climate change. Right? If we let climate change get out of control and something like 50% of the world's biodiversity is destroyed and there are huge consequences for the human and ecological systems, then the whole deep green ecology philosophy is going to be pretty much a moot point. So first and foremost, we've got to tackle emissions. If we do that, then we can have these other arguments. Now, there's nothing inconsistent or illogical about that. Right? But the only way you can get to that argument, if that's an argument you want to use in the debate, is to know that worldview. Right? Is to ask the question, why can someone like George Monbiot or Patrick Moore have that philosophy? If you just draw the spectrum and understand the viewpoints, that's great, and that will get you past 80% of your opponents. But it won't get you past that that top elite of teams who don't think in spectrums, they think in worldviews. Right? Because that's the most options you can have. That's the most sophisticated set of positions that you can possibly have. So that's all, because I'm hugely out of time. I'll take questions if I can get it. I'll also go into much more detail about environmental spectrum on the weekend, so if that's your question, you can probably hold it. But if you've got other questions, please bring them up now.
I think you've still got about 10 minutes to speak, so it's going to arrive until 6:30.
Awesome.
So you can probably...
Well, what I'd like to do is actually kind of, I'm in the middle of writing an article, probably for Silvertongue or NPR or something, I don't know, about another part of advanced first principles, which I've never actually thought of before, but follows on from what we were talking about before, which is the idea that if you understand worldviews, you actually open up a whole range of arguments you didn't have before. And one of the really interesting things to me at the moment is finding circumstances where an argument which, because of intermediate first principles, I would immediately tag as being one kind of philosophy, is actually argued by people that are completely diametrically opposed, in some cases, philosophy. And there's some great examples there. And when you think about why that can exist, you actually get a whole series of arguments and options that you didn't have before. So if people understand that point about advanced, or at least if enough of you understand that point about advanced first principles, I'll go on and give you a couple of these examples. There's a few that I'm working on right now. The first one is in law and order debates. Right, so I just read this really cool book called Texas Tough, right, which goes on all about how Texas developed the world's most hardcore law and order system, where they imprison one in everyone, especially if you're black, and the whole history of that, where they started out as actual penal farms, where workers in prisons actually worked in prison-owned farms, and that money went back to the state. Funnily enough, that created an incentive for more prisons and more farms, so that more revenue could go to the state, and how those things changed over time. But one of the really interesting things about that is looking at the history of kind of US kind of criminal justice practice, is that in the early 1900s, and for about 100 years before that, it was considered best practice in kind of sentencing and criminal justice process in the US to have what's called indeterminate sentencing. And when you think about it, this is actually a pretty cool idea, really. Not that I'm in favour of it, but it's a cool idea. And the idea is, well, it's kind of odd to pick a sentence, particularly a quite long sentence for someone who's committed a pretty serious crime, when the length of their prison term's not really the point. The point is to make sure that they've been adequately punished and to make sure that they're sufficiently rehabilitated to be released. And if they're not either of those things, then they shouldn't be released. If they haven't been sufficiently punished, then don't let them out. If they're not rehabilitated, then definitely don't let them out, because that's going to be a really big problem. So what we should do is we should say, well, you're going to serve between nominally, say, 20 to 30 years, but it's for this review board and for the warden of the prison and for these other smart people to figure out. And if you happen to be an exceptional kind of rehabilitation candidate and you work your ass off and you knit like a crazy man, and you apologise to the victims and your family, whatever, then you might get out earlier than that, right? And if you don't, you're going to rot and die in this jail cell. And that sounded like at the time a pretty progressive kind of Victorian era kind of way of thinking about crime and justice. The problem was, surprisingly, it was grotesquely abused by justice and prisons officials, which meant that prisoners who pissed them off stayed in jail forever, and prisoners who paid bribes or were from the right race or from the right sex or religion got out a little bit earlier than their colleagues did from other groups, which turned out to be a real problem. So that system persisted right through until the Nixon administration, right, which is way before anyone in this room apart from me was born, but wasn't actually that long ago. And what happened was a strange coalition of both the left and the right got together to defeat indeterminate sentencing. Now, there's not much that the left and the right in America agree on, in fact, almost nothing, except that they hate each other and think each other are the fault of all evil. But they both agree that indeterminate sentencing were bad. But they agreed that indeterminate sentencing was bad for completely diametrically opposed reasons. So, let's do the easy one. Why would conservative Republicans think that indeterminate sentencing was bad?
We just exploited and let bad criminals out too early.
Right. They wanted to be able to campaign on law and order and say, we're going to set massive minimum penalties for people who do bad shit. We're going to crack down hard. And this idea that some egghead sitting in the warden's office can decide that because your crocheting skills are up to a particular standard, you get to go free now is bullshit. Right? Especially if they're black. It's double bullshit. So, why would the Democrats be in favour of this law which would allow the Republicans to pass laws to send people to jail for longer?
Same egghead was keeping people in.
Yeah, right. Because their constituents, because the groups that supported them, the civil rights lobby, African Americans, because people who, thought this was a really bad thing, were against the idea of indeterminate sentencing because it was grossly unfair. It meant that people who had the least means and the least resources got the longest punishments, not necessarily because they deserved them. So the two sides combined to overturn this law so they could have a free-for-all about which of completely opposite directions law and order policy would go in. Now, if the topic had been, and obviously you won't get it now because it doesn't exist anywhere in the world, but if the topic had been that this House would abolish indeterminate sentencing, it sounds like you would immediately think this is one or the other, but it's actually both. Right? It's actually both a left argument and a right argument, and whichever one you pick opens up completely different cases. But if you run a spectrum over this issue, you'll park it in one part of the spectrum and not realise that there's multiple campuses. The other one that we're at the moment is education reform, right? And I don't know if anyone's ever done it, but let's do the education first principles spectrum.
Yes.
Well,
Steve. Steve has a jet on.
we got to. No, I'll do it on this one.
You turn the projector off, Steve. Yes.
So, education first principles. Now, hands up if you've ever done a debate about education. Anything about education. Right. So, this should be shit easy, right? Everyone's done a debate on education. Every experienced debater in the room has done a debate on education. Probably multiple debates on education. What's the first principle spectrum? Intermediate first principle spectrum.
Mandatory education for everyone up to year 12.
No.
Or?
No, it's just not the first principle spectrum, right?
Yeah.
What's one end of the argument versus the other end? There's a whole academic discipline of education theorists, education historians, they go to education conferences, they fight like cats and dogs. What are they fighting about?
Government control versus parental control.
Right, well that's pretty close. So the first side is choice, markets, accountability, and the other side is standards and curricula. So, both sides are in favour of schools being awesome, kids learning how to read. But they're diametrically opposed, at least at the extremes, in how you deliver that. So the right, and I've done this backwards, but anyway, it doesn't matter. one side of the spectrum say the way you do that is to maximise choice and markets and accountability. So you should have lots of testing, you should have lots of regimes that allow for alternative schools to be developed, like charter schools and religious schools, academies, and you should have as much accountability as you can, which means you should test the shit out of kids, you should publish those test results, and you should make decisions about which schools live or die, which schools get money, which schools don't, based on which kids test well and which kids test poorly. The other side aren't against choice and markets and accountability per se, but they think they don't work, right? And what they're in favour of is strong standards backed up by a strong focus on curriculum, and those other things undermine that. And the simple example is the accountability stuff sounds awesome, but once you create a test that says the number of kids who can read at a certain grade level will determine how much money your school gets, all the teachers in that school will teach these kids how to read up to that standard. Right? They won't teach them history or geography or science or esoteric stuff that doesn't get tested, because if they fuck up on the other stuff, the school's going to close. Right? So don't take any chances about that. Teach the crap out of the test and don't worry about the other stuff. Whereas if you have a strong curriculum, strong set of standards, and you grade and train teachers up to that standard, then you should get that result. But of course, you don't always. Now, the example that gets thrown around in some of these are things like charter schools. Anyone know what a charter school is? Anyone who's first year, second year, third year? Want to have a go? What's a charter school?
Chris is theoretically.
Is it?
A third year.
Okay, well, going once, going twice. Viral.
They're like locally controlled schools that have their own boards and decide what's going to be taught.
Yeah, exactly right. They're basically like fully privatised schools. Some of them operate for profit, some of them don't. That's not the point. But the point is they have total control and autonomy over in broad measure what the curriculum is that's being taught, usually because states in the US have very broad and vague and fuzzy curricula, so that creates basically unlimited space for those schools to decide what they teach and what they don't teach, and the power to hire and fire teachers at will, to pay them whatever they like, and to set standards for who gets into that school and who doesn't. Now, that fits exactly, you would think, within the choice, markets, accountability stuff, and should be exactly the kind of thing that would be hated by people in the standards and curriculum side of things. The interesting thing is, when charter schools first got the biggest kind of expansions, certainly at a federal level of support in the US, it was under the Clinton administration, in the early years of the Clinton administration. Now, Clinton, for those who only know about his dalliances with women younger than him, and not anything else, Clinton was what was called a New Democrat. Now, the New Democrats don't live down here, the New Democrats live more here. Right? They're not hardcore lefties, but they are lefties, right? Because they're Democrats, at least most of them. Now, Clinton got the idea from his predecessor, George Herbert Walker Bush, that charter schools were a good idea and they should be funded, and so he put this massive amount of extra funding and legal support into allowing charter schools. Now, a lot of people on the further left, or necessarily the far left, were pretty outraged by that and said, how can this Democrat, how can this left-winger get in bed with this idea that's all about markets and choice and shit that we don't think works and that we think demonstrably harms kids? And the argument wasn't that he had been persuaded by the arguments of choice and markets and accountability, because then he wouldn't be a Democrat anymore on this issue. He had a completely different reason for doing it. So we all know what the reason were for why Republicans supported them. What were the reason why a Democrat supported them? No one wants to have fun?
Because you can set up the standards and whatever you like within the charter school.
Right, because Clinton and Gore and his generation of Democrats were obsessed with this idea called reinventing government. It was all about trying to take the lessons that people had learned from business and from like the biggest foundations in the world and bring them into government, so that to sort of de-bureaucratise government and try to allow people more space and choice to set their own standards, set their own benchmarks. Now, even though charter schools also had the effect of meaning that teachers could be hired and fired, it's something that teachers' unions obviously don't like very much, and teachers' unions have enormous amount of influence on the Democratic Party, and so Clinton would normally have not done anything that would have offended the teachers' unions anywhere near that greatly. He did believe, for completely different reasons than if you smash the teachers' unions and give someone total control over the schools, you'll get change. He did believe that there needed to be a change in the way that schools were organised, and that control from like these bureaucrats who didn't know anything about education necessarily was a bad thing. So two completely different sets of arguments, even though charter schools were seen by some on the left as leading to terrible outcomes, and arguably they do, right? But at the time, Clinton was prepared to be persuaded by that because he thought for different reasons entirely, but they would be a useful thing for the education.